Welcome to this President's Dream Course series, Journalism Under Siege. I am Mike Betcher, and along with Professor John Smeltzer, we are coming to you from the University of Oklahoma's Gaylord College, where we are studying, along with our students, the dangers that journalism is facing across the globe. They're being killed, they're being imprisoned, they're being intimidated. And tonight we're going to focus on what most experts believe is the most dangerous place in the world to report and to be a journalist. And no, it's not thousands of miles away in Syria, it's closer by. It's next door. It's Mexico. The Committee to Protect Journalists, which is the leading nonprofit organization in the world that advocates for press freedom across the globe, produced a video that tells the story of the stark nature of journalism in Mexico today.
Pues a mi padre que se lo llevan por ser una persona con la cual no se le podía callar de otra manera.
Fue asesinado, lo asesinaron y apareció en las Chiapas.
Su única arma era su grabadora, su pluma y su libreta, su computadora, su teléfono, que eran sus herramientas de trabajo. Si lo único que nos queda es exigir justicia, pues hay que gritarlo. Justicia para cada periodista asesinado en este país. Muchas gracias.
I watched that and it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart to know just across the border in Mexico, journalists are facing this sort of a problem. A problem just trying to stay alive. They're dying on the job. And journalism is probably the only profession in the world where you're just a target and are killed for just doing your job. And Mexico is the place where it is now the biggest problem, according to most experts in the world. We have two people here that can speak directly about this, who are the two best guests you could have for this class to talk about this issue tonight in Mexico. To the far left is Courtney Radge. She's the Advocacy Director for the Committee to Protect Journalists. She's also the Chief Global Spokesman for CPJ for their press issues. While you're watching this class at home on television or live streaming, you can go to cpj.org. On their home page, on the front landing page, they have a lot of information about what is going on in Mexico today, the threats that journalists face there, and it's a learning tool that you can use. We are, after all, a class, so we're going to be very informal, and you have a chance to be inside of our classroom. Courtney is a PhD that she received from American University. She's also, in 2016, published her first book, Cyber Activism and Citizen Journalism in Egypt, and we're so happy to have Courtney. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And next to me is Oscar Cantu. He's come to us from Ciudad Juarez in Mexico. Those of you who don't know geographically where Juarez is, it's just across the border from El Paso. It is a city that is one of the fastest growing cities in North America, and he's partially responsible for that. As a businessman, he promoted foreign investment in Ciudad Juarez, and at the same time, he had an interest in journalism and the service it could do in Mexico to make it a better place to live, to make it a better democracy. So in 1979, he got into the newspaper business. And in 1990, he started a newspaper called El Norte de Ciudad Juarez. I speak Spanish, but I do it with an Oklahoma accent, so forgive me. Mm-hmm. And this year, Mr. Cantu made international headlines when he decided he had to shut down his newspaper. This was a newspaper that was a crusading journalism organ that went after corruption in Mexico, went after abuses in human rights, and reported on the narcotics gangs operating in Mexico and narco-terrorism. It was a very, very tough job, as you can imagine. And finally, Oscar, you decided this year, enough's enough. And enough was enough because of the death of this reporter, Miroslava Breach, who was working for Oscar, reporting in the state of Chihuahua.
Yes.
What happened?
Well, she reported how the infiltration of the factic power regarding the drug trafficking cartels were infiltrating the political party system. And we published that, and everything that was happening in the west of Chihuahua, the southwest part of Chihuahua, where the gangs were sieging, that they had these cities around there, the municipalities controlled, and really it's a failed state in that area up until today. So we tried to report as much as we could, thinking that we were so far away from that area that we wouldn't get close enough to get bothered. And I authorized everything that was published, but I never realized that Miroslava was getting all this information because she was born in that area. So many of the people that knew her then or there, you know, I never linked the connection between her living in Chihuahua City, where she was in charge of our bureau, a news bureau, and Chinipas, where was the place where she was born and where all this was happening. So, and she never mentioned that she was being threatened or that she had calls, or she disregarded all of those things, and until her death, unfortunately.
What happened? How did she die?
She got shot. She was taking her son to school, 7 o'clock in the morning, trying to avoid. She saw her assassin in front, and she could have, from what we understand, she could have run through him with her car, but she wanted to protect her son. So she, while protecting her son to stay away, it was the moments when she got shot 8 times in the head. So it was very, very a tragedy. She left 2 children, a daughter and a son.
That really, it hit your soul. We were talking earlier, and you talked about being at the funeral. This wasn't, this was more than just an employee dying. This was an assault on you, and an assault on journalism, and
I'm sorry if I'll get a little bit emotional. When I heard what this piece that you saw right now, it reminded me, it took me back in time of everything that we went through through those 27 years, specifically the last 17 years, on what we reported. And it took me back at the funeral. I didn't know why I felt so much grief. It was not only because of Miroslava, who was very close. We were very, very close professionally. We talked every day, 2 or 3 times a day. I believe I was the last person that she talked the night before. She was a very, very professional journalist and ethical. But all the feelings of those 27 years, suddenly you get them at the same time in a funeral. I just couldn't stop feeling what I was feeling, because not only her death, but all the things that we have gone through, and how society were not aware or not interested in those happenings as it is happening right now in our country, where we find that 43 students disappear and nothing happens. So 43 students, can you imagine 43 students at the same time disappear and nobody knows anything about them? So imagine a journalist one by one. It's nothing compared in the amount of people that's being hurt. And we're talking about impunity. It's really impunity what is causing all of this problem for journalists, because I believe from Article 19, the information that we have, maybe you can correct me, only and the special prosecution of prosecutors of office, federal office in Mexico, only 97.1% of the cases have been resolved. So it's really something that is unacceptable.
Well, she was reporting on how the narco terrorists, the drug cartels were infecting politics, putting money into politics and basically taking over some sectors of the government. So it's a double whammy there. She has the narco terrorists mad at her and mad at you, and she's got corrupt officials in the government mad at her and mad at you.
Exactly.
Who killed her?
I think it's the system, the drug, together with the political system, that are in conjunction, okay, because they're working together. One needs the other one to be able to work together or be protected. It's such a huge business, and they put so much money into controlling the parties, the political parties, and the candidates. They put candidates, and that's what we reported. We named the candidates that we were supporting, and also the parties that were linked to those candidates were very upset of this information that we were publishing. So when you come down and say, who can you trust in this situation? And say, why they don't act? And this is a question that I frequently ask and say, why hasn't this been solved? Because they know who did it. In fact, today, there's a newspaper in Chihuahua City. Today, they published the names of the assassins of Miroslava and who was involved and how it was, and that investigation was developed by the Attorney General's office. And the governor said in April that he made a public statement that they knew who they were, but today they leaked this information after her sister, Miroslava's sister, sued the state government because they didn't let her be part of the investigation or see the investigation. So she won. She went to the federal court. She won the case, and the state government was forced to open the investigation to her. But a day later, they leaked all this information to a newspaper without a source. So I ask myself, what is going on here? Why are you saying openly who they are and you are not bringing them to justice? This is a question that needs to be answered.
after her death and after the funeral on the 2nd of April of this year, this headline was not seen just in Ciudad de Juarez, it was seen around the world. It said, adios, goodbye. This was your last edition and you decided to stop publishing.
Yes.
Why?
As an act of protest, because when I looked back and saw all the publications that we had made in the past, all the exposés on corruption, on political corruption, on social issues, on human rights, affecting human rights, then we said, if we keep on doing what we've always done, we will always get what we've always gotten. And I didn't want for that to happen, but number one was that I didn't want to put in jeopardy any person that was involved in an organization through exercising the type of journalism, investigative reporting, critical reporting, counterweight type of reporting. And I knew that we wouldn't back down from that. And if we cannot exercise a right and tell the people and have the freedom to inform the people, it was not something that we would want to do. So I said, let's shut it down as a protest. And we say, you get the criminals and we will open it up again. Yes, and I never really thought that we would get the coverage that we got by printing this edition. And the fact is that I'm here today because of it.
You received great support from around the globe, but there were people that said, no, that's not the way to protest. The way to protest is to continue reporting.
Yes.
What do you say to those critics? I mean, it's easy to be thousands of miles or hundreds of miles away and say, we should keep the paper open. But you have many journalists that have been killed just this year or in the last few months. I mean, did you consider that maybe we should fight rather than close her down?
I say that we should fight, but there are other ways to fight, not only by printing. There are, first of all, in 2005, and I believe the publishers or owners of more than 50 newspapers, we got together in Hermosillo, Sonora, because a journalist got shot in Hermosillo. And the Inter-American Press Association gathered us, and we went to Hermosillo, and we pledged, and we said that we would, if we had another journalist killed, the press, the owners of media there, we would send a journalist, every one of us, a journalist, to put the pressure on the government so they would resolve those cases and do not let impunity take over. But we didn't follow up. We didn't follow up on that. So if you don't follow up on what you say or you're going to do, and it keeps happening, I think that one of the things that needs to be done is to gather the media owners, because we are co-responsible for the safety of our journalists. The other thing is that we requested the federal government to treat the crimes against freedom of press or freedom of expression as a federal crime, to legislate to be a federal offense. And they said they would, but they didn't legislate till today. So if we have impunity and if we put ourselves, especially in states, bordering states like Chihuahua, which is a crossing, very important crossing for the drug organizations, it's really very difficult to be in investigative reporting, in particularly this type of cases and corruption, linking them without putting your people, your persons, your journalists in jeopardy, or ourselves. And the pressure from my family was also very important, because they have been with me, and they talked to me and said, we've supported you all these years, we never had a complaint. Your newspaper took time from you for us. So don't you think that you should also think about us? We are afraid. And I said, well, yeah, I need to listen to them also. I need to listen to the families of our people that were also very, very afraid, because we knew that if you are able to kill newspaper people, news journalists, and 43 students, and he said, well, we need to do things different, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Dr. Raj, when I covered Latin America in the 1980s, it was in El Salvador and Nicaragua, and those were dangerous places to work. And Mexico was a place we'd go to decompress. Mexico City and other cities in Mexico, it was a safe place to go. And I thought that, the worries we had also were in the Middle East. We're in Lebanon. You used to write, by the way, Dr. Raj was also a reporter who worked for El Arabiya, also the Daily Star in Beirut, and for the New York Times. And the Middle East was someplace we worried about. And when I worked in Beirut, we'd worry about kidnapping and being killed there. What happened in Mexico, and where's the trend going? And when did this start to erupt like this?
Well, I think Oscar hit the nail on the head, which is impunity. So, murder is the ultimate form of censorship. If you're able to murder a journalist and there are no repercussions, nobody is brought to justice, that sends a very powerful signal. It sends a signal to other journalists, watch what you write or cover, and it sends a signal to those who would attack, threaten, or kill journalists that they have very little to fear. And the fact is that impunity is rampant, sadly, not only in Mexico, but worldwide. So we systematically track all of the killings of journalists for their work, who are directly killed because of their work since 1992. And every year, except for last year, the greatest proportion of journalists every year are murdered. And 9 out of 10 killers of journalists go free. Imagine 9 out of 10. What other profession can you think of where people are routinely murdered and killed just for doing their jobs? And that's what we see in Mexico. We see the rise of the drug cartels. There is, there's no repercussions that they face for this. My colleagues from the Committee to Protect Journalists went to Mexico in May to meet with the president. We did a big investigative report into these cases of impunity, seeing what was happening, why are they stalled. We presented the findings to the president, trying to get him on the record that he would make impunity, combating impunity, a key tenet of his final year in office, to do more, to appoint an attorney general who knows about this, a special prosecutor. Sadly, a couple of weeks later, Javier Valdez, one of Mexico's leading journalists, was murdered. So you wouldn't think that Mexico would have the same number of journalists killed this year as Syria.
And what did the government say in Mexico? Did they say, was it lip service, or did they say they would make?
They said they were going to make some change. They did make a new appointment to the special prosecutor. He said that he would address impunity. I think he finally mentioned fighting impunity, which before that there was just no mention of the, basically systematic murder of journalists in Mexico. But it is very, very dangerous there. Journalists are taking extreme risks. Many of them have had to flee where they're based, or temporarily relocate, or permanently relocate. One of the things that we're able to do at the Committee to Protect Journalists is provide assistance to journalists to get out of the area, but that's not what anybody wants. They're journalists because they care about what's happening in their communities and they want to cover that. So, taking them out is not the best solution. Of course, it might be a life-saving solution, so we need to do that. But ultimately, the goal is to make it safe. The goal is to enable reporters to report from Mexico. Mexico is a democracy. How is it possible that there is such rampant killing of journalists there and nobody is being held accountable?
Can you answer that question?
Well, yes, I have my own opinion about that. I believe that we live in a system today that it is very contaminated. We have a party system, political party system, that has taken over everything, controls everything. And our institutions, and I mean institutions like media, business organizations, I mean organized society, businesses, organized society, teachers associations, professional associations, or whoever leads this organization, all these type of organizations have a lot of conflict of interest, because they're very much tied into the political, economical system that rewards whoever goes along with the flow. And whoever goes against it is not well seen or well accepted. And I think that the country right now it's generating such a steam of anger because of the corruption, and what we're seeing, 14 governors in our state are being held right now accountable for corruption. 14 governors. And you're talking about 14 governors, most of them belonging to the president's party. So you can imagine those governors being part of the problem and all this system that surrounds them. So I think that we have right now, and I explain it as if you have a pool with contaminated water, and you cannot drain the water, but you have to get new fresh water in. So I believe that it's our responsibility, my generation or our generation responsibility, to prepare this new generation for those challenges that they're going to have to undertake, because my generation failed. I'm talking about where I live. I can only speak about my experience. I cannot judge or say anything regarding other places except for Juarez. But in Juarez, yes, it grew. We grew 5 times in 10 years. The city grew 5 times in 10 years. So you can imagine the growth, the money, and the flow of not only the drug that comes to the United States, but also we have a market, a local market. And it's protected by this system, okay, with our institutions, whether it's police or government or parties, or it's something that we really have to work. So next year with elections, I think we're gonna find something very interesting happening, because the people with the earthquake in Mexico City are very much angry and don't want to give money to the public money to the parties, to the political parties.
And I mean, if I can just add to that, I mean, corruption is actually one of the most dangerous beats. It is, on the website you can go and look at what was the beat that each journalist who has been killed doing their job was covering. What gender were they? What were they? Photojournalists or print journalists? You can get all of that data, and we see that political figures and governments are behind a significant proportion of the murders, and that corruption is one of the most dangerous beats in Mexico, but also worldwide.
By the way, if you're in the television audience or streaming audience or in the live audience here, you can tweet questions to me at Mike Boettcher, MikeBoettcher. Is that correct? Well, that is my name. I saw you raise your hand. But if you have a question, you want to ask it, go ahead. That's why I'm checking my phone, by the way. I turned my phone off like a good boy, and then I got a message, people can tweet you questions, so I turned my phone back on. So I'm sorry if I wasn't being disrespectful of what you were saying.
Hi, my name is Storm Jones, and I'm a junior here at Gaylord College, and I just wanted to ask Mr. Cantu a question real quick. So one of your closest colleagues was killed, and how did you adjust in your personal life? You have had to have threats against your life. Did you get security after this happened, and how did that affect you personally?
No. Well, it affected me emotionally very much. I had a time of grief, very deep grief. Imagine yourself, you're working 40 years in activity, and suddenly you stop. It's like your adrenaline just cools down. But the matter of fact is that I felt that I had lost something more, which I had believed in. No, I never had any security before or after. I refuse to have it because I want to send a message that I'm not afraid of. I'm not afraid. And they ask me, are you afraid? No, I'm not. I've never been fearful of them or the organized crime or politicians. And no, the answer is no.
Well, let me get to the heart of it. I mean, you're taking great risk, and we've talked about this, and you say you're not afraid. So what is it about you that makes you put yourself out front, publish a crusading newspaper, go public around the world saying, I'm going to stop this because you're executing our reporters with impunity? What is so important about journalism to you that you will do this?
Love. Love. To me, love goes beyond fear. Love of freedom, love of justice, love of equality, love of rule of law, love of a better quality of life, love for a human being. Love. That's what motivates me.
And how is the rest, the people who go to work every day, who raise their children in Mexico, who read your newspaper, who now have to read other newspapers, do they want the same thing? And those people who oppose you, what is their heart full of? Hate?
Well, I think that you have two questions. One is what I want and what I do, because this is like diets or nutrition. I want to eat nutritionists. I want a good nutrition. I want to be slim, but I go eat hamburgers with bacon and cheese. So one thing is what I want and what I do. This is the same with people. They want a peaceful community, but they're not willing to do or sacrifice or become responsible for the practices that we accept, or the responsibility to take on issues that are shown by the media or by us that we publish. And that's why what you want and what you do is different. And the other question, and the other one was?
And the people who are in opposition, I mean, is their heart full of hate of what?
No, I believe that, honestly, it's envy. Envy.
Envious of what?
Envious of not being able to do what we are doing, to take on decisions like this, to talk in public, nationally, internationally, to say whatever you need to say publicly and not be afraid. And because you show yourself in front of a public, you put yourself at risk. Don't you think that by me going and talking and asking for justice for whoever killed our journalist, don't you think that those people really don't want me to go out and move the dust? Of course. Okay, of course they will. But somebody has to do it. And whoever doesn't do it, they say, he makes us look bad. So that's what I found out. And they rather not report anything. It's amazing because locally, nothing of this has been reported. Okay? Internationally, nationally, everything is reported, but locally, it's not. So it's very unfortunate.
It's interesting because in Pakistan, also a very dangerous country for journalists, both because of the state and because of non-state actors, there was a period of time when news organizations wouldn't even cover the kidnapping or killing of other journalists, or if they did, they wouldn't name them or they wouldn't name the outlet because, you know, they wouldn't want to give them any sort of publicity.
Exactly.
So there was, and we hear this a lot in many places in the world where there's a real lack of solidarity among journalists. But the Pakistan story is really powerful because a lot of the editors there decided to get together and create a group around journalist safety and make a concerted effort to work together to combat violence against journalists and to, you know, turn the kidnapping and killing of journalists into a major news story. And it's had an impact. It has led to journalists being rescued. There is greater attention being paid in the media to the murder of journalists, and they have, you know, their own ways of communicating. I think they used WhatsApp to coordinate. You know, so it's really powerful what journalists can do to combat violence when they come together, so that at least they're all working together towards the same goal.
Yes, and also the importance of the the international support. It is very, very important. You have no idea. Mexico moves sometimes faster when you have an international pressure than an internal pressure, especially when you are negotiating with different agreements with different countries that say, no, you need to protect human rights, you need to protect this, you need to protect that as part of those negotiations. And that's why it's very important. I've learned this by this world coverage that we had because of this publication, and that took us to UNESCO, where Courtney was part of that organization, UNESCO in Jakarta, on Freedom Press Day. And from there on, and all the interviews and all the different reports that have been done on our case, and all the journalists that have been killed, has been something that puts pressure, especially now that we're getting near elections. That's where we need to put more pressure.
Well, and elections are very dangerous for journalists.
Very dangerous.
You know, not just in Mexico, but again, around the world. We've seen, you know, elections are oftentimes when journalists are specifically targeted, where they're caught up in protests, or, you know, even in this country, we saw some violence against journalists, not at the same level in many countries, but, you know, we're always on being extra vigilant around elections.
And especially because you're exposing many politicians that have conflict of interest, very strong economic conflict of interest, and they're very threatened by what you expose. So that makes it more dangerous.
We have a question on Twitter from one of our former students who is in New York working for Bloomberg, and Allie Stratton, whose parents are here, writes, "Greetings from New York City. Oscar, do you ever see a solution to political corruption and cartel violence in Mexico? If so, how?"
There's always a solution, definitely. I was involved in the violence that Juarez 10 years ago became the most violent city in the world. For 2 or 3 years, we had that unfortunate label of becoming the most violent city in the world. And I can tell you that by working together, bringing the community together, I was part of that and an activator of those observatories or watch groups coordinating themselves with government, making sure that the federal, municipal, and state governments would work together, having them sit down in front of you, being accountable, being transparent, but you have to move yourself and put yourself together. Now, these people are very smart, and they know how to co-opt you, and they try this, and it works. It works. They're very effective because their system is designed for that. But the question is, yes, you need to work on. You need to work on building or strengthening your social tissue, building your education. You have to work together on opportunities, creating better opportunities, having a vision of what you want, what you see. But you need the leaders that are not in the public conflict of interest.
How do they co-opt you? I mean, do they call you on the phone and say, if you write something we don't like, we're going to kill you or your reporters? Or
No.
do they say, we'll make you rich if you don't do something? Or both?
No. They co-opt you. The citizens get co-opted by getting you to Mexico City, flying you over there, meeting the president, meeting all these big political figures, and then now you're a figure and you get to be known here, known there, and they get you to be on their side, and they string you along with just winning you over. And that has happened in my city. So I said, what's wrong? Because we started this organization on being an observatory, and that's how we were able to work together and change a system, a judiciary system, where in Mexico you are guilty until proven innocent. The state of Chihuahua was the first state where that changed, and you are being innocent until proven guilty. And that was in this stage of where all this violence came. So, but you need to work, and you need leaders, uncorruptible leaders that are willing to work above the private interest, to look for the public interest, the common good.
We have a question up front here.
Thanks. My name is Jeremy Cowan. I'm a grad student here. And this may be a terribly naive question, but when you're talking about working together and stuff, my godfather worked at the El Paso Times, and I didn't know if there was any sharing or was there any working together with, considering that El Paso is literally a stone's throw across, almost dry ditch right there. Was there any working together? Did their reporters come over to Juarez to help or to report on the same things or anything like that?
Unfortunately not. The El Paso Times, when the situation was very delicate, they prohibited their journalists to go to Juarez. And they wouldn't report anything. They wouldn't correspond with anyone. They would just, whatever they saw on television, they would rewrite. But no, unfortunately, the El Paso Times has changed with so many organizations, first Gannett, then Media News, then so many directors and publishers, and then reporting to Arizona, then to Denver, then to, it's a very difficult a situation working with them.
Something that could be related to what you're talking about. We have a message, a question tweeted from Katie. Are there any third-party investigators, Courtney, pursuing violence against the free press who could hold the government accountable? So, I mean, you're a third party basically doing that. Are there others out there trying to do that?
Yeah, there are. I mean, I think Ukraine is a really interesting example where Pavel Sheremet, another very famous, well-known investigative journalist in Ukraine, was gunned down and murdered near his house. And the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project did a big investigation into it, the OCCHRP, which also worked on the Panama Papers, which many people will remember, big collaborative reporting project. They did an investigation there. CPJ, my organization, went to Ukraine and did an investigation there and then presented our findings to the president. And actually, I have two colleagues who are in Brussels as we speak, talking to the European Union about making sure that Ukraine investigates this murder because there is a financial relationship there, and Ukraine is, trying to be European in its value system and, governance, et cetera. So we're basically saying, you've got to hold them to account for following up on this murder. So it does happen on individual cases, but given that last year alone there were 47 journalists killed, it's very difficult to do investigations into each one. Usually between, around 40% of journalists killed every year are murdered. So it's very difficult to take time to do that. Maguindanao massacre of the worst single day massacre of journalists in the Philippines several years ago. There have been investigations. It's thought to be known who committed the massacre, and yet no one has been brought to justice. I think some of the most successful cases have been where we see the news media and journalists collectively gathering together to do an investigation into murders and see what they can uncover. But ultimately, it's about getting the government to then hold the perpetrators to account.
But one of the difficulties is saying, did this person die on the job? Rebecca, there's a list of the journalists that Oscar talked about that have been killed this year, but there's discrepancies in the numbers because it's difficult to confirm why someone died. And tell us about that challenge.
Yeah, it's very difficult. So one of the things that we do every day, we're basically like a news service where we report on attacks on the press like a beat. And one of the things that we do is we investigate every killing of journalists to determine whether it was related to their work. And we have to investigate a lot of cases every day. We investigate many, many more than the ones that end up on our website. But for every case, we need to independently verify the facts. We need to have double sourcing for the facts behind the case. We're basically using journalism to help journalists to do this type of reporting. And it's not like there's easily available information about the journalists killed in Mexico or in Iran or in Venezuela. So we're digging, we're talking to other reporters, we're talking to their families, we're talking to officials. We're doing our own every single day investigation and looking at, was that person doing journalism? And we're not just looking at professional journalists, people who have credentials or went to journalism school. We're looking at people who are doing journalism and doing this journalism in the public interest. And it might be that in a very repressive country, journalism might look very different than it does in an open country, for example. So we're really looking at the specifics of every case and what happened there, and was that killing related to their work or not.
What can our students here at Gaylord do? I mean, what could students in Norman, Oklahoma at Gaylord College, a great journalism school, what can they do to affect change?
So there are a lot of things. First of all, paying attention to this as an issue is important because, as you heard Oscar say, this international attention can have an impact. And oftentimes, that's the only impact that we can try to have. There are many countries, Vietnam is a great example, where the government is not susceptible to internal pressure, but they are potentially susceptible to international pressure. Cameroon is another one where, again, like limited opportunities for pressure from inside, but it matters. Their international reputation matters. So by bringing this in, these cases to light, putting pressure for investigations into murder. Similarly, last year was the worst year on record for journalists being jailed for their jobs. 259 journalists in jail for reporting. A third of those in Turkey, which is ostensibly a democracy.
A NATO ally.
A NATO ally, an ally, with the whole war in Syria. One of the journalists there, Can Dündar, who we gave our International Press Freedom Award to last year, uncovered a story about weapons transfers in the south of Turkey to Syria. This has major national security implications, not just for Turkey, but for all of the countries involved there. And instead of welcoming this report, using that information to make better policy, he was arrested and thrown in jail. He eventually fled, and now he's living in exile to avoid being among the dozens and dozens and dozens of journalists who have been arrested there. But what you can do is actually join the campaigns for these journalists. This year we have a postcard campaign for our Free the Press campaign, and we will send the postcards that you write to the journalists in prison. So we've already done this in several countries. Ahmed Abba is a journalist in prison in Cameroon for covering Boko Haram. He was covering terrorism, but he's actually been charged with terrorism himself now, like many of the journalists around the world who are in prison. So we write to these journalists because they get the postcards, or they'll hear from their family who gets the postcards, and it gives them hope. It makes them know that people are advocating for them on the outside, that maybe there is some hope to be had. So when you see a petition, it makes a difference. Mohammed Rasool, who was a Vice reporter, I don't know if you remember, there were these 3 Vice News reporters who were arrested in southern Turkey for covering the PKK, again, a terrorist organization according to Turkey. The two Western reporters were let go within a few days, but the Iraqi fixer was held for several months. So we did a big petition. We eventually did free Rasool. He got out of prison, but there are many other journalists who remain behind bars. But when those leaders are speaking at the United Nations, and there's a big campaign going around to free this journalist from jail, it might lead to a question being asked by another ally or by a journalist, or putting them on the spot, because a lot of countries do care about their international image.
Speaking of journalists who are charged and could possibly face jail, we have one next to us here. You're under charge in Mexico, correct? Let me quickly give you the background. You may have read some articles about it. Probably the worst serial killer in modern history, perhaps, operated out of Juarez. It killed hundreds of women, it's suspected. But government officials tried to cover it up.
Yes.
And you exposed the fact that they were trying to cover it up. So what did they do? They charged you with the crime.
Well, what they tried to do is they got people to accuse us of defamation. At that time, defamation was a criminal offense. So they tried to put us in jail by getting people to accuse us, okay, of defamation or some other thing, because with two accusations, you wouldn't have possibility of getting bail. You wouldn't get bail. So we were very much harassed in that sense. We would try to be bankrupt by the same government people, because we were exposing all of the things that they did. They put in jail 2 innocent persons because they had the political pressure. The public pressure was so strong, and international pressure was so strong because of the killing of women, that they needed to have somebody there. So they just got two innocent people, put them in jail. They stayed in jail for 3 years without being sentenced. Then when they were sentenced to 50 years. One of them got killed in prison. The other one, we were able to get him out after 5 years. So imagine all those years working with this type of cases, and the anger that we provoked on that government by exposing everything that they were doing. So it was very difficult, a very difficult time. Fortunately, what helped us was the American press managing editors of the United States and Canada that went to have their only meeting, I understand, outside the United States. They had it in Mexico City. They invited me as their keynote speaker, and the Dallas Morning News started printing their first page in our newspaper to let the public and the government know that they were also, like that we were part of them, so they backed down. So and I'm saying again, it's the international pressure that helps us, or that was a balance. And as a third party, as you were mentioning, I proposed at UNESCO that there would be a unit, okay, or the organization that would be a third party that we could work together with that international party that would come and make the government sit down and be accountable, as we did in Juarez when we got rid of the violence. It worked. We knew how it worked, and it worked for us. So I think it can work internationally, but we need a third party that comes along. By ourselves, we can.
We have a question from over here, I believe.
I'm a graduate student here. Excuse me. I'm just curious, are the economic pressures that journalism as an industry that we're all facing here and abroad, is it making this issue worse here and in other countries?
There is a definite relationship between the economic health of the news industry and the safety of journalists, absolutely. So there are a couple of different dynamics. First of all, we've seen, for example, the decimation of foreign news bureaus, American foreign news bureaus, for example, and an increased reliance on freelancers. So what does that mean? That means that you have a lot of freelancers going to very dangerous places like Syria, Iraq, Mexico, where they're not prepared to face the dangers. Maybe they don't have the right training or the right equipment, the right networks, the understanding of how to keep their sources and their colleagues safe. In fact, we saw in Syria, after the murders, which I'm sure many of you heard about, of several journalists, most gruesomely, Jim Foley and Steven Sotloff, AFP, the Agence France Presse, decided not to take unsolicited freelance work anymore. So there's that whole dynamic. On the other hand, you have state-owned news organizations like RT, Al Jazeera, et cetera, that are either state-owned or financed, that are CCTV in China expanding their news operations. But much of that news is often verges into propaganda, and there are all sorts of issues around editorial independence in those sort of news agencies. But because they're funded by the state, they're relieved of a lot of the economic pressures that others are facing. Similarly, in terms of the economic model, we have a new gatekeepers. So there was a flourishing of pluralism with all of this new technology, et cetera. And so you saw, a decline of kind of traditional gatekeepers. But I think to a large extent now, you see that the social media platforms on which many of us get our news have become in many ways the new gatekeepers. And so you have to, make your content work on Facebook, on Twitter, on Google, on the App Store, whatever it is. And so you become beholden to, those algorithms, to those choices of those organizations about how they're going to prioritize news or not. And so you see, a lot of money and funding being spent to figure out how to work on those platforms. And also, you have journalism is a profession that I think struggles to pay well around the world. I know, in many parts in Egypt where I used to live, and lots of places that I've been in Africa to do media assessments, journalists barely get paid anything. And so not only are they barely able to make their livelihood, but it opens up all sorts of potential for, bribery, for back of the envelope journalism, for yellow journalism. And of course, it just takes money to be secure. It takes money to get, emergency HEFAT training, to get first aid training, to have the right equipment, to have a communications plan, to have the training to understand how to keep your communications secure so you don't put somebody at risk. So there's definitely an impact of the current economics on the safety of journalists.
We have another question on Twitter from Sarah Beth Guevara. She asks, what should journalism students know about how to safely report government corruption, or is it even possible? Is it possible to safely report on government corruption? It doesn't appear so in Mexico, at least.
Well, it's dangerous, definitely. Depends on who you pick on and what subject you talk about, whether it's social, education. When you talk about the corruption between the education union teachers and and all this that goes on, and that gets you affect interests that are very, very in depth in those organizations, in those institutions. So it is, if you go in depth journalism, investigative, critical, counterweight, it's definitely it's dangerous.
You mentioned earlier today, before we began the class, a fascinating story, even when you did a feature story about how some of these narco-terrorists, specifically El Chapo, was becoming a folk hero among some of the population. Oh. You got a threatening call from another narco-terrorist. Tell us about that.
Well, our feature story people, you know, soft news, they decided that they want to do a feature on music, narco corridos, you know, those stories about narcs and music, and they selected music that would only reflect what one cartel, one of the leaders of one of the cartel. So we got a call from the opposites, from their enemies, and saying, threatening us, are you part of this cartel? Are you working for this cartel, or what are you doing? Because you have not reported on our corridos, our music. It's also a leader, a big leader. So here you have this guy, you know, fighting over what you are reporting, what you're featuring on music, a culture, and really say, well, no problem. We'll tell us which ones you want, and we'll publish them. No problem.
Do these cartels try to bribe you and your reporters?
Definitely. Well, not us, because they know that for many, many years we've stated and we put a limit on them. They know that we do not. When you report on cartels directly, you are calling them, okay? But you are not a policeman. You cannot say you are a drug dealer or this or that. You have to prove it. You have to. But if you go beyond certain limits, and you mention them, they will come and visit you, and they will try to bribe you. And they will say, well, either you get money or you get a bullet. Which one do you choose? People, I choose life. I said, I don't want the money, but I don't want the bullet. So let's keep our place in peace, because we know that we are not protected by authorities, okay? So we just, we know, and by experience I've known, living in the border, what not to do to attract these drug cartels near you.
But at the same time, you're reporting on them, and you're reporting on corruption.
We're reporting, well, yes, but not the ones that are near you, not the ones that are in your area. Those are the dangerous ones for us. It's like getting the snake to bite you, and you're very near the snake. No, well, at least that snake is far away from you. But we found out that it was not true. It was a cell that was part of the Juarez cartel that is living in that area. So,
we have another question.
Yes, I have a question. My name is Mark Griffin. I teach Spanish at another university. I just finished a long book by Anabel Hernandez, Los Señores del Narco, and I was curious about if you could comment on it. She outlines the levels of corruption between the Mexican government, especially the PRI, and the Sinaloa cartel. But she also implicates the PAN. How far does corruption go? Does it affect all the parties? Does it affect all the parties equally? And what politicians provide an alternative to this kind of corruption?
Well, Anabel Hernandez is a very well-respected journalist. I respect her very much. She's a very in-depth investigative journalist. And yes, she's right. It goes way, way down. I can tell you from a fact that I've known governors that are not in the drug related business, but I know that they had police chiefs that were because what I've learned from this is that you need to manage the situation. You manage the unavoidable, you avoid the unmanageable. So it's management, because you cannot get yourself freed from the drug trafficking. Where it's a demand, the demand exists, the market exists, and it exists here in the United States, the main source of the market. So it is very difficult for a country that has such low levels of poverty not to get involved in something that is an opportunity for some people that had never had anything. So it's a way up, and it's even in politics, it's the same thing. It's part of the problem that we need to strengthen our social tissue, our education, and our opportunities for everyone. And but it's very difficult to say who. It's a system. It's a system, and everybody takes a little bit of that at some point in time.
We have another question from the audience. Who's next?
Yeah, I'm John Schmelzer. And there was a report that came out yesterday that I distributed to the class from Transparency International that reported that 51% of Mexicans said they had to pay a bribe in the past 12 months to go and access basic public services. How do you combat that as a reporter, to go and to explain that to the public, that they shouldn't have to be paying that kind of money to go and get basic services? Or is the government so corrupt now that that's the only way you can get anything done?
Well, the thing is that there is no career in public service placed in government. So if you are a government official, a public servant in the service administration, public administration, you don't have certainty if you're going to have a job after the term when this governor or this mayor or this president finishes his term. So how can you expect someone to be not attracted by having a different source of income, because they don't know what will happen to them, because there's no civil service career in the public administration by law.
So there's no system within the government to protect the workers.
And also, it's a matter of economics. If you get your what you need as a citizen, if you need something done faster, you know that you will get it fast if you oil the machine.
We have a question from Mr. OK. Question for Oscar: how is your generation preparing the next generation for the challenges at hand?
My generation is not preparing the next generation. I say that we are a lost generation, unfortunately. And I think we are very much responsible for everything that is happening, because we didn't do what we have to do. That is why I am working on trying to reach as much peers, as much people that I can, to get them together, to work in precisely help the next generation. We need to work, and not my generation, but bring up the millennials and say, hey guys, you need to come in, you need to come on board, because you are the guys that are going to have to deal with this. So you better start looking at this now. You as students right now should be thinking of this for the future, because it's going to be your future. We're not going to be around. So learn or unlearn from us what we didn't do or what we do. That's what I believe.
I'd like the students in this audience to change shoes for a little bit and imagine yourself in Mexico. Would you be sitting in a class in Mexico studying journalism if you face the same dangers that they're facing now? I mean, would you be in love with journalism? You're shaking your head. How about it would make you think twice. I mean, and justifiably so. There's nothing wrong like that. I mean, Will Cornelius asked a question on Twitter. Have any of you, what kinds of threats have you faced? I mean, in Latin America, in the early days when we covered the wars in El Salvador, they had death squad lists in which, you know, American reporters were on. And there was grave concern that we'd be taken out, and some people were killed. You know, some of those on those lists were well-known journalists like Chris Dickey, who's now the foreign editor for the Daily Beast. He was a Washington Post reporter then. But you know, imagine, and this is kind of a litmus test. I mean, how much do you love journalism? If you knew that since March, according to the list that Oscar had, and Oscar, we had this list behind you, that there are 10 journalists killed in Mexico just since March, would you be willing to die to do the job? And that's a tough question you have to ask. It's a question, you know, I've asked myself a lot. We're told all the time, you know, we were told that no story is worth dying for. But, you know, Oscar, it seems to me you're telling me that this story is worth dying for. You're not taking protection. No. You're talking in public about this. Mm-hmm. I'm frankly gravely worried. But you're showing no fear.
Well, no, but it doesn't mean that I don't take precautions. I show no fear, but I take a lot of precautions. I do a lot of prevention. I'm very careful where I go, who I go with, what time. I don't have a schedule. You don't know when I'm going to go out, when I'm going to be back. You don't know if I'm home or I'm not home. I'd rather move by myself than have people around me that could be corrupted and saying where I would be. I'd rather be and protect myself the way that I learned and was taught by my father many, many years ago, that we were targeted for kidnapping many, many years ago, 50 years ago. So I learned that, and but I think that the more that I bring people together, the more that media start talking about it. At least I got the owners of our city saying, okay, Oscar, tell us what you want and give it to us, and we'll publish it, or we'll televise it, or we'll radio it, but give us whatever you want. Okay, fine. So that's why I'm bringing them together, because you see, to do this, it takes time, it takes effort to go and talk to people, to go to organizations, international organizations. It takes time, and I think it's worth it. I think it is worth it. Democracy needs this. An open society, a free society needs a freedom of expression, freedom of press. There's no free society if there's no freedom of press or expression. That's my belief.
We have another question. Megan?
Yeah, I'm Megan Ross. I'm a journalism undergrad here. So, like you said, the systematic killing of journalists has been sort of a recent, or at least it's increased recently, and according to CPJ data, 3 of the deadliest years for journalists have been since like 2012. So why is that happening now? What factors do you see contributing to that recent increase? And is that something that you foresee continuing or sort of stalling out? And if it does stall out, why? And what can we do to stop it, basically?
Sure, so that's a great question. There are, I think, a couple of different dynamics at play. First of all, you've had a couple of very deadly conflicts going on. So the Iraq War in 2006, it surpassed the number of journalists killed in Iraq from Vietnam. war. So, that was over a decade ago, and it's still ongoing. And then Syria was incredibly dangerous. So those two conflicts alone have seen hundreds of journalists killed. Plus, there are conflicts raging in other parts of the world that are sometimes more localized, and you have the rise of non-state actors around the world, as we've heard about a lot in Mexico. But there's a more fundamental shift that has happened in recent years, which is the shift in power dynamics between journalists and those that they cover. So the power dynamics, in large part because of technology, have really shifted. So, when we were talking about covering former wars, the Central American wars of the 80s or the Middle East or Bosnia, journalists played a very important role. And most actors and parties to those conflicts wanted to get their stories out through the journalists, because the journalists were the gatekeepers. They needed them. Those in power don't need journalists anymore. They've got Twitter, they've got Facebook, they've got the internet. So journalists no longer occupy that privileged role that they once did. And so now, instead of seeing them as, useful, so even Osama bin Laden gave interviews to journalists. Now journalists have become props in propaganda films. And not only ISIS, but also in Mexico and elsewhere, they've been used, to actually show brutal killings of journalists. So that shift, that technological shift, has shifted power dynamics that has, I think, increased the insecurity of journalists because they don't occupy that privileged role. When you couple that with the conflicts that are ongoing, with endemic impunity, as I mentioned earlier, the statistic about 9 out of 10, as long as I've been doing press freedom advocacy since transitioning from journalism, it's been a static statistic that hasn't shifted, even though there are UN resolutions and lots of international attention now to this issue, UNESCO, lots of attention. Still, we don't see the political will behind it by many governments. And so between all of those factors, murderers not being held accountable, epidemic of jailing of journalists, a shifting technological atmosphere or ecosystem of the media in which journalists are no longer in a privileged position, I think has created an environment where journalists are more at risk. And also, more people are doing journalism. More people can be journalists. My book is about citizen journalists in Egypt. They were filling a void by reporting on human rights abuses, police violence, et cetera, and we see that around the world. So to some extent, you probably have a lot more people doing journalism than you ever have in the past as well.
To talk to you about how things have changed to this point, in the early 1980s during the Salvadoran War, the Contra War, or even when I was in Lebanon in 82 and 83, you would be able to cross lines. So I could cover the Salvadoran army and say, well, I'm heading down the road, and we'd cross into no man's land and go into guerrilla territory and interview the Salvadoran guerrillas. Same with the Contras or the Sandinista army. Some people died. I was kidnapped at one point but survived. But people did die, but you could do that. Fast forward to Afghanistan, for example. There was no way that I was going to be able to cover the Taliban in Afghanistan, or I'd be dead. There was just no way to cross lines. Things have devolved that much during that period.
And there's another factor, which is the so-called war on terror. So you've really seen since 2001, and also now even more so since kind of the rise of ISIS, you see a lot of reporting and journalism being equated with terrorism around the world. And so you've seen terrorism being used as an excuse to clamp down on journalism, to put journalists in jail. And I think that's created a very pernicious environment in which there's this idea that you have to balance national security versus journalism or freedom of expression, which is absolutely untrue, because press freedom actually enhances our national security, but that's not the rhetoric we hear from politicians. So you have this dynamic where terrorism has also become an excuse used to repress journalists.
Do we have another question from the audience?
Hello, my name is Hushang Nur Mohammadi. I'm originally from Iran. I live in the community. First, I want to congratulate you, Mr. Cantu, for your courage and also your emphasis on love. And I am sorry about the loss of your colleague and your friend. I know that these drug cartels, for the most part, are there because of the drug use and abuse and addiction in North America. So are there times that you say, I wish Americans would do this and we'd have fewer problems down in Mexico? Just talk to us about that. And what can I tell members of the community that I'll run into tomorrow and the next day, the things that we can do here to help alleviate some of these problems, because people don't realize that Mexico is next door and Mexico's problems will be our problem. And even if we don't look at it as a pain and suffering that our fellow human beings across the border are feeling, it is going to be here. It's going to be our problem. So please speak to that. And also, Courtney, I'm sorry, I've drawn a blank on your last name. Also, you can make some suggestions that I can share with members of community on how to help around the world deal with this issue. Thank you.
The first thing that I would like to hear from the United States is to accept that they are part of the problem. So we start by accepting our role in what is a problem, a common problem. I don't see that. I believe that it's more of blaming the corrupt cartels and the Mexicans. There wouldn't be corruption. It takes two to tango. It takes the Americans and take the Mexicans to do this together. It's not one or the other, it's the same. So it is the recognition and acceptance that this country, and I suggest you watch a movie that is going right now, that is showing right now. It's called American Made by Tom Cruise, is the actor, that shows the what happened in the Iran-Contra situation. And there's another movie called Kill the Messenger, where this situation of drug-related operations and businesses grew out of the need to stop the Iran and the Contras in Nicaragua and Iranian. The United States needed the money to buy arms, so they let a lot of drugs come in. They organized the drug traffickers. Because this is a known fact, but it is not recognized. It is something. We had the arms that were sent to Mexico with the knowledge of this government approving the arms sent to Mexico, and I didn't see anybody became responsible for that situation. So all the arms that goes to Mexico, they're being traded by the United States. And I live in the border, so we see this situation going on. So I would like to see the United States to hear we have a problem. We can solve the problem together. We can get together and solve the problem, and not satanizar,
Sanitize.
No. Not make us look as the bad guys.
Yeah.
¿Cómo se dice? Profile us like.
¿Cómo?
Demonize. When you say, well, where do you think this drug comes through? You have to take a look at who distributes this here. In Juarez, El Paso, the biggest gang is the Aztecs, and the Aztecs is American born in El Paso. It's not a Juarez, it's El Paso. It's in the United States, but they do their crimes in Mexico, and they are good citizens in the United States. So we have a lot of that in the border, where you see people, going into Mexico, they do their criminal acts, and then they come here and they're good citizens. So it's really a challenging situation. So that I would like to see that.
And in terms of what you can do, I think there's a range of things. One thing is you can look at the byline of what you read in the morning on your app, or the newspaper, or wherever you get your news, and think about what that person did to bring you the news. You can subscribe and pay for news, because that makes a difference in the quality. You can think about what the choices of how you get your news are, but you can also do things, because the United States matters internationally. As the advocacy director at the Committee to Protect Journalists, when we're trying to get a journalist out of jail in Egypt, we're talking to the US government and asking them, please, can you bring this up with the Egyptians? In Ethiopia, before President Obama went to Ethiopia for a presidential visit, we advocated for the release of these journalists and for the administration to bring up their imprisonment before their trip, and they were released. So we can see the power of the United States. But the problem is that moral authority is being severely undermined by the demonization of the press, by the pillorying of journalists and labeling, news that you don't like as fake news. There are 9 journalists in prison last year on false news charges in Egypt and Ethiopia. So it has real implications. We've seen Cambodia use the fake news term to send Voice of America and Voice of Radio Free Asia out of the country, which are the US government-funded news organizations there. So there are real impact of US leadership around the world, and we have to keep that strong. So, you can write to your representative and say, this is an issue that matters to me. You can sign that petition when it comes across your desk to free whatever the latest hashtag is. We call it slacktivism, but actually it can make a difference. So, there's a range of different types of things you can do, and you're all many of the people in this room here are going into journalism. The situation facing journalists, the investigation into their murders, those are stories. So use your journalistic lens to shine a light on that, and that can help make a difference.
I would also suggest that it is very important to talk about freedom of press, the importance of freedom of press and what it represents to the society. I think that we, the media, and schools of journalism and associations of journalists and all the organizations need to talk about what we are about. Freedom of press and freedom of expression. It is very important, and also to value the content. Content should be paid for, valued content. I've heard, I believe John or someone saying that we got accustomed to getting our free news or very inexpensive source of getting the news. So the only way to keep that going is by having people supporting, whether online or print or broadcast, whatever, support and talk about it.
Oscar, I can't tell you how much I admire your bravery in what you're doing. And Courtney, I can't tell you how much I'm astounded about the work that you do and the knowledge that you have. And it's so important that we organize as journalists and support each other around the globe, because having been in some of those circumstances myself, it can get pretty lonely. Right. So thank you, and thank you.
Thank you.
And I also want to thank President David Bourne of the University of Oklahoma, who helped make this possible by funding speakers like Courtney and like Oscar coming here. I'm Mike Betcher, and for John Schmelzer, all of you out there in the television audience and the streaming audience, thank you for joining us at Gaylord College from the University of Oklahoma.
Thank you very much.